Today, we are taking on a source that is, well, absolutely foundational to anti-colonial thought.
It really is a truly pivotal analysis.
Yeah, an analysis so sharp, it fundamentally changed how we understand global economic history. We're diving deep into Walter Rodney's seminal 1972 work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
And this deep dive is crucial, I think, for anyone engaging with anti-colonial, decolonial, or even development studies today.
Definitely.
Because Rodney's work is so much more than just a history lesson, isn't it? It's really a revolutionary text. It systematically shifts the entire framework of analysis.
How so, exactly?
Well, instead of focusing on Africa's supposed internal flaws or deficiencies, Rodney places the blame for poverty, for stagnation, squarely onto the systemic, calculated forces of imperialism and the capitalist system itself.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately then. Rodney himself was just a towering figure, a scholar, yes, but also a revolutionary activist.
Absolutely. His knowledge wasn't just academic, it was intensely practical, dedicated entirely to transforming the social and political worlds around him.
Which makes his assassination in 1980 at only 38 all the more tragic.
A huge loss. But his intellectual legacy, it provides this rigorous framework needed to challenge that deeply ingrained idea that Africa's poverty is somehow innate, or maybe just accidental.
Or even just the result of, post-independence issues.
Exactly. He digs deeper. And what's immediately fascinating is how precisely Rodney frames the whole mission, identifying responsibility.
Right.
He argues that the mechanisms of underdevelopment operated on two critical levels. The first, and he says the major, responsibility rests with the operation of the imperialist system itself.
So the structure.
The structure, that is, the vast systemic process of draining African wealth and, crucially, actively blocking the development of its resources and its technology. That's the big picture.
And the second level is, well, it's far more controversial, maybe more personally challenging for people listening today.
It definitely is. Because Rodney implicates the people who manipulated and benefited from that system.
Which includes?
Well, obviously the primary actors, the industrial capitalists, the financiers of Western Europe, and later the United States. But significantly, he also includes the workers of those metropolitan countries.
Okay, the workers. That often raises eyebrows. Why them?
It's a provocative argument, no doubt. He suggests that the workers of the imperial powers benefited directly from the exploitation and underdevelopment of Africa.
How? Through what mechanisms?
Through things like lower commodity prices, maybe better wages in industries that were financed, ultimately, by colonial extraction, even subsidized social services that were completely unimaginable in the colonies themselves.
So it implies the benefits of empire weren't just confined to the elite.
That's his point. Which means that the fight for liberation, for genuine development, it becomes necessarily a global systemic struggle. It requires a shift in mindset, even among those who benefited, perhaps unknowingly, in the West.
That structural point is powerful. It definitely challenges, say, a simpler narrative of a purely united global working class against capital.
It complicates it, certainly.
Yeah.
But, and this is vital, this analysis, detailing all this external responsibility, it does not in any way remove the agency of Africans.
That's a crucial caveat he makes.
Absolutely critical. Rodney insists that while understanding these external causes is vital, his analysis doesn't remove the ultimate responsibility for development from the shoulders of Africans themselves.
So the book isn't an excuse.
Not at all. The whole point of the book is to arm Africans and anyone fighting oppression with the necessary knowledge, to understand the mechanics of the system they need to challenge, to overthrow and replace with a self-reliant development strategy.
Knowledge as a tool for liberation.
Exactly. That's the core of his scholar-activist philosophy.
Okay, so to really understand what was lost, what was derailed, Rodney forces us to rewind. Before significant European contact, let's say before 1500, where was Africa on its own developmental path?
Right. And he starts by insisting we first have to define what development actually means. It's not just about GDP or material wealth.
It's broader than that.
Much broader. For Rodney, development is inherently multi-sided. It's about a society's overall increased capacity.
Okay.
So at the individual level, that means greater skill, enhanced capacity, increased freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, all these things leading eventually to better material well-being.
And economically?
Economically, the core definition is the society's increasing capacity to deal with its natural environment. How? through applying science, improving technology, and having a superior organization of work.
And he stresses this was happening everywhere.
Everywhere. Rodney forcefully argues this process of societal evolution was universal. Every continent, Africa included, was constantly increasing its capacity to win a living from nature, to understand and shape its environment.
So Africa was fully participating in this universal human story. You see the progress from, early stone tools through the Neolithic changes.
Absolutely. To the widespread use of metals. The shift from just hunting and gathering to domesticating animals, developing staple crops that was happening across the continent, adapted to local conditions.
And what was the social foundation for this, according to Rodney?
At the baseline of this society, he locates the predominant social principle of pre-1500 Africa as communalism.
Communalism. What did that look like in practice?
Well, it was essentially a mode of production centered entirely on family and kinship ties. The concept of private property, especially land ownership in the modern capitalist sense, was largely absent.
Okay, so how did things get done? How was labor organized, if not through wages?
Critically, land, the main means of production, was communally owned, held in trust, maybe by a lineage head or a community leader, for the benefit of all.
And labor itself?
Labor was recruited based on social obligations. Family ties, kinship responsibilities, age sets were really important.
Can you give an example?
Sure, you see things like the Dockboy work teams in Dahomey. These were groups, often based on age, who would offer collective labor to help individuals in the community with big tasks like clearing land or building.
Sort of like a community work bee.
Pretty much, yeah. Or another example, among the Bemba, traditionally, a bridegroom would work for his father-in-law for a period. It was part of the marriage obligation, a social bond, not a cash transaction. Labor was embedded in social relationships.
Got it. And within this communal structure, what was the key technological leap that really pushed development forward internally?
Rodney points very clearly to the introduction and spread of iron tools, the iron axe and the iron hoe. He identifies this as the single most important technological change underpinning African agricultural advances before widespread European contact.
Why iron specifically?
Well, iron tools allowed societies to clear forests much more efficiently than stone tools, to cultivate harder soils, and implement more sophisticated farming techniques.
Like what?
Things like terracing on hillsides, developing crop rotation systems, and selectively breeding and domesticating key staples suited to African environments. Millet, yams, certain types of bananas.
And these agricultural improvements allowed for?
For increasing specialization of labor, supporting larger, denser populations. And that, in turn, is a prerequisite for forming larger political units for states.
Which leads us to political stratification, because Africa wasn't just small villages by the 15th century, right? It was already changing, moving away from pure communalism.
Absolutely. It was dynamic. We see the rise of powerful, often quite stratified, states and empires across the continent.
Can you name some examples he gives?
Sure, there's ancient Ethiopia, the great Western Sudanic empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Also kingdoms like Bunyoro-Katara in East Africa or Great Zimbabwe in the south.
And these weren't purely communal anymore.
No. These emerging states were developing more complex systems. Some utilize forms of corvée labor, basically, unpaid labor demanded by the state for public works, like building roads or palaces, not unlike practices you'd find in feudal Europe, actually.
So inequality was already emerging internally.
Yes, inequality was emerging organically. Ruling classes, administrative structures, specialized crafts, these were solidifying long before the major European intrusion.
Okay, this is where the argument gets really critical for understanding what happened next. Rodney concludes that when Europe and Africa established closer trade relations around the 15th century, Europe only possessed a slight edge. That seems counterintuitive, maybe? How does he define that slight edge?
This is such a crucial point for his whole underdevelopment thesis. He argues the gap wasn't some massive chasm in civilization. It was a relatively small difference, primarily in organizational maturity and economic structure. That slight edge, he says, represented the difference between a fledgling capitalist society in Europe, one that was developing liquid capital, early banking, more advanced shipping, new forms of organizing production like early manufacturing and African societies that were still largely operating within communal and sort of feudal-like structures.
And why was that slight difference so important?
Because capitalism, with its inherent drive for expansion and profit accumulation, was fundamentally geared to exploit pre-capitalist systems. That slight organizational and technological edge became the leverage, the mechanism through which Europe could begin to extract wealth and actively create the massive developmental gap we see later. It wasn't preordained, it was created through the interaction.
Okay, so let's move into that period of interaction, roughly 1500 to 1885. This is the era dominated by the transatlantic slave trade and those initial coastal contacts.
Yes, and this is where Rodney argues that that slight edge was violently magnified and exploited. He's absolutely unequivocal. The European slave trade was a fundamental factor in African underdevelopment.
And not just that, but simultaneously.
Simultaneously, a primary engine driving Europe's own early economic growth and capital accumulation.
It directly echoes that stark observation from Karl Marx, doesn't it? That the hunting of black skins signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production.
It's a direct link. Rodney meticulously details how this horrific traffic in human lives functioned as a massive financial engine for Europe.
How did that work? How did enslaving people tangibly fuel capital accumulation back in London or Paris or Lisbon?
The exploitation of African labor, both directly in the trade and then on the plantations in the Americas, generated vast amounts of surplus value, liquid capital. This capital wasn't just spent on luxuries. It was reinvested in key metropolitan sectors, accelerating Europe's economic transformation.
Like what sectors?
Shipping, definitely. Building bigger, faster ships. Insurance markets like Lloyd's of London grew fat, insuring slave voyages. The formation of powerful joint stock companies, pooling capital for these risky but incredibly profitable ventures. And of course, manufacturing that supplied goods for the trade or processed plantation products.
He gives specific examples, right?
Yes, very specific, like the French port of Saint-Malo. Its fishing industry was massively revived, not by French demand, but by the need to supply cheap salt cod to the slave plantations in the West Indies. African forced labor created a guaranteed huge market that revitalized a whole sector in France.
And it wasn't only the trade in people, even though that was central. Other African resources were also being extracted.
Absolutely. African gum, for instance, sourced from places like Senegal. It was essential for the textile industry in Europe, used in the sizing process for cloth. Hugely important.
What else?
Or consider ivory. We often overlook it. But the ivory trade enriched merchants, particularly in London, and supplied raw material for a surprising range of European goods. Knife handles, combs, billiard balls, even piano keys.
Piano keys.
Yeah. Each of these trades involved extracting resources at incredibly low costs, essentially paying only for the labor of extraction and transport, not the resource itself, and funneling the profits back to Europe for investment and, crucially, funding technological research and development there.
So the contact was fundamentally asymmetrical from the start. It actually accelerated European technological development.
Right. The Atlantic trade routes became, as Rodney puts it, Europe's laboratory for naval technology, map-making, large-scale organization, understanding winds and currents.
While at the very same time, it systematically arrested Africa's own internal capacity for innovation.
Precisely. This is the core of his technological stagnation argument. It's fascinating. In the early 16th century, European traders often relied on Asian and African manufactured goods. High-quality cloth from India and West Africa was actually sought after.
But that changed.
It changed rapidly because the trade relationship was structured to be unfavorable to Africa. Europe had no incentive to transfer and actively prevented the transfer of its developing capitalist techniques, the organizational methods, the scientific knowledge, the machine technology to Africa's pre-capitalist systems.
And the result was this devastating reversal.
A complete reversal by the 19th century. Africa was increasingly forced to concentrate its production solely on exporting raw, unprocessed materials, cotton, cocoa beans, palm oil, and then importing the finished manufactured goods like cloth or soap, often made from the very materials they had exported.
Which obviously crushed local industries.
It decimated local artisan production, removed the incentive for developing advanced local technology, and locked Africa into a structural dependency on Europe that, Rodney argues, persists in many ways today.
We can't leave this period without talking about the sheer human cost. The population loss from the slave trade is horrifying.
It's staggering. And Rodney points out that apologists often use conservative estimates, maybe 10 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, to try and minimize the impact.
But the true loss was far greater.
Far, far greater. You have to account for the unrecorded smuggling, which was significant, but also the deaths during the brutal capture raids, the long marches to the coast, the deaths in the holding pens, the horrific conditions on the ships. The mortality rate before even reaching the Americas was enormous.
And what was the socioeconomic consequence of losing so many people, primarily young adults?
It meant African population stagnation or even decline in some areas for centuries. This is a major historical anomaly compared to population trends elsewhere in the world during the same period.
And losing people means losing.
Losing labor, losing the fundamental human capacity to tame and harness nature, as Rodney puts it. Development requires people, hands and minds working. Removing millions of the most productive members of society fundamentally arrested demographic growth and therefore economic potential across vast regions.
And beyond the numbers, the European presence itself acted as a catalyst for violence and political disruption within Africa.
Yes, the external demand for captives fundamentally distorted internal African societies. Insecurity became pervasive.
How did that change things on the ground?
Instead of investing time and energy in long-term productive activities like improving agriculture, mining gold or iron ore, developing crafts raiding other communities for captives became a highly profitable, sometimes necessary survival strategy.
He gives examples of this shift, doesn't he?
He does. He cites specific regions, like parts of the Gold Coast, that were known for gold mining. But by the early 1700s, they'd shifted drastically towards specializing in slave raiding, sometimes supplying thousands of captives a year to European traders.
So the European demand basically introduced an economy of violence.
Exactly. An economy of violence and predation began to replace or overshadow the economy of production in many areas. This caused tremendous internal dislocation, conflict, and instability, even in regions that weren't directly raided but lived under the constant threat.
Okay, so this long period of extraction and disruption sets the stage for the next phase, formal colonialism, after the scramble for Africa around 1885.
Right. And this is where that structural exploitation, which had been developing for centuries, becomes fully institutionalized, formalized, and intensified under direct European political control.
And Rodney famously rejects any idea that colonial rule was some kind of trade-off, oppression balanced by benefits like roads or schools.
He absolutely demolishes that idea. He strips away any pretense of a civilizing mission or benevolent intent, labeling colonialism, quite starkly, a one-armed bandit.
A one-armed bandit, meaning...
It is designed purely for taking, for exploitation, focused entirely on the massive systematic export of surplus wealth from Africa to the metropole, with virtually nothing meaningful put back in.
This leads us into the core of his analysis for this period, the specific economic drainage channels. How was wealth systematically sucked out?
He details several key mechanisms. Let's start with direct labor exploitation. Colonial governments and companies ensured that wages paid to African workers were kept at extremely artificially low levels.
How low are we talking?
He gives examples like a Nigerian coal miner working underground in dangerous conditions might earn only 1 shilling per day. Rodney calculates this was about 1/6 of what an American miner was paid for producing the same amount of coal at the time.
1/6. And this wasn't just market forces setting a low wage.
Not at all. It was structural dependency by design. And the sort of cruel genius of the system, as Rodney points out, was how they could get away with paying so little.
How?
They didn't have to pay a living wage that could support the worker and their family. Why? Because they relied on the workers' lingering connection to the land back in their village.
So the family farm was basically subsidizing the colonial enterprise.
Precisely. The worker could survive, barely, because their family was still engaging in subsistence farming. African indigenous social structures were effectively subsidizing the profits of European capitalist enterprises. It's quite perverse.
Okay, so that's direct labor. What about the financial mechanisms? These sound more complex.
They were incredibly sophisticated and very effective at draining wealth passively. Rodney meticulously details the role of the colonial currency boards set up by the British and French.
Right, the currency boards. Can you break down how they worked to expropriate African earnings? It's often misunderstood.
Okay, let's try. Imagine a colony, say the Gold Coast, earns foreign currency US dollars, maybe German marks, by selling its cocoa on the world market.
Okay.
The currency board system mandated that this foreign exchange couldn't be held or used by the colony itself. It had to be immediately handed over to the board and converted to the colonial currency, West African pounds, for instance, which were tied to British sterling.
So the colony gets local currency, but what happens to the valuable dollars or marks?
That foreign exchange was sent to London. There it was held as sterling reserves, backing the local colonial currency. And what did the British government do with these massive reserves taken from its colonies?
Let me guess. Invested it.
Primarily invested it in British government stock, essentially lending it to the British government at very low, sometimes zero, interest rates.
Wow. So Britain was effectively borrowing vast sums of capital from its colonies, using the colony's own export earnings to finance its own government spending and industrial development.
Exactly. The colony earned the money through its labor and resources, but the metropole Britain or France retained the actual use and the financial benefit of that capital, a massive, continuous, hidden transfer of wealth.
Beyond the financial maneuvering, there was also just raw physical coercion. Forced labor was widespread, wasn't it?
Absolutely rampant, especially under the Portuguese and Belgian colonial regimes, but used by all powers to varying degrees, particularly for major infrastructure projects.
Rodney gives examples here, too.
Yes, chilling examples. Take the construction of the railway line from Brazzaville to the port of Pointe-Noire in French Equatorial Africa, built between 1921 and 1933.
What happened there?
Workers were forcibly recruited, often marched hundreds, even over 1,000 kilometers from their homes to the construction site. Conditions were atrocious. Historical records, even colonial ones, show that often around 25%, one-quarter of the recruited labor force died each year from starvation, sheer exhaustion, and rampant disease.
25% mortality per year.
It's almost unimaginable. It shows that African life itself was treated as a disposable input cost, cheaper than providing adequate food, housing, medical care, or, God forbid, actual wages.
And the extraction continued right through the trade structures themselves, even for voluntary trade.
Oh, yes. The big European trading companies, names like the United Africa Company, UAC, CFAO, COA, held effective monopolies or near monopolies in many colonies.
And they used that power
to buy African agricultural produce like cocoa or palm kernels at prices far below the prevailing world market prices. The profit-making started right there, at the point of purchase.
And then came shipping.
Then came shipping. The shipping lines, often owned by or linked to the very same metropolitan interests that owned the trading companies, charged exorbitant, completely unregulated freight rates to transport these goods back to Europe.
Is there data on those rates?
Rodney digs up some powerful comparisons. He notes, for example, that the freight charge for carrying a ton of flour to West Africa from Europe was around 35 shillings. But sending that same ton of flour across the Atlantic from Europe to New York cost only 7.5 shillings.
A massive difference.
Huge. And who ultimately paid that difference? The African producer, whose initial selling price was depressed, and the African consumer, who paid inflated prices for imported goods. The entire system was structurally rigged, from farm gate to European port.
And this whole system actively discouraged diversification, didn't it? It pushed colonies towards monoculture.
Absolutely. Economies were deliberately engineered not to meet the diverse needs of the local population, but to serve the specific demands of metropolitan industries.
So the Gold Coast became all about cocoa.
Exactly. The Gold Coast focused almost entirely on cocoa, Gambia on groundnuts, Senegal on groundnuts too, Uganda on cotton. This intense specialization made these economies incredibly fragile.
How so?
They became extremely vulnerable to external price fluctuations. If the world price for cocoa crashed, the entire Gold Coast economy suffered dramatically. They had no control over the price of their single major export, and they were also vulnerable to pests or plant diseases that could wipe out their main crop.
And this created long-term dependency.
Locked them into long-term dependence on the metropolitan buyers, both for selling their single commodity and for importing almost all necessary manufactured goods. It prevented the development of a balanced, resilient internal economy.
Now, it's also vital to highlight what Rodney calls the non-monetary benefits that flowed to Europe from colonialism. It wasn't just cash.
Right. This is about the strategic advantages, the research boost, the raw materials access that colonialism provided. He describes it as an indispensable link for the massive technological transformation of European and North American capitalism in the late 19th and 20th centuries.
The colonies were essentially funding R&D in the metropole.
In many ways, yes. But also, strategically, Africa supplied key raw materials that were absolutely vital for the industrial and military developments of the 20th century. Materials they might not have accessed so easily or cheaply otherwise.
The examples here are really striking, aren't they?
Deeply historic and globally significant. Copper, for instance, mined under brutal conditions in the Congo and northern Rhodesia, Zambia today, was essential for the age of electricity. It went into wiring, electrical components, powering the infrastructure boom across Europe and America.
And even more profoundly,
the uranium used by the United States to build the very first atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came primarily from the Shinkolobwe mine in the Belgian Congo.
wow, that's a direct, devastating link.
A direct link. Africa also supplied other crucial minerals for specialized steels, alloys needed for new industrial processes, and military technology. These resources fueled massive industrial growth and job creation in Europe and North America. Steelworks, aluminum plants, huge processing factories like Unilever's soap and margarine operations, all fed by African raw materials.
And what was left in Africa?
Rodney's summary is absolutely damning and poignant. Europe and America gained industrial complexes, advanced technology, and mass employment. Africa was left with, in his words, holes in the ground, depleted soils, and impoverished populations.
So moving beyond the purely economic extraction, Rodney then turns his focus to the equally damaging social and ideological consequences of colonialism. He argues development was arrested on a human and political level, too.
Yes, and he starts by utterly dismantling the whole rhetoric of this civilizing mission, the idea that colonialism brought progress and upliftment.
The numbers alone tell a story, don't they? The spending on social services for Africans was minuscule.
Horrifyingly so. He contrasts the figures. In 1934, for instance, the British government spent about £6, 15 shillings per person on social services within the British Isles.
Okay, and in the colonies?
In its African colonies, the expenditure was a tiny fraction of that. Ghana, relatively well off, saw about 7 shillings and 4 pence per person. Nigeria and Nyasaland, Malawi, less than 2 shillings per person.
That's a difference of, what, 20, 30 times less?
Easily. A massive disparity that exposes the lie of colonial beneficence. And it wasn't just about money. He cites the Portuguese example. After 500 years of presence in Mozambique, by the time Rodney was writing in the early 70s, they had failed to train a single African doctor there. Not one.
500 years. And even the few services that did exist, they weren't for everyone, were they?
No, they were entirely racially stratified. This was explicit policy, especially in settler colonies like Kenya or Rhodesia, but present everywhere.
How did that work?
Services were prioritized first for the European administrators and settlers, then perhaps for the Indian or Levantine merchant communities who served as intermediaries. And only then, often grudgingly and usually through underfunded missionary efforts, were minimal services extended to the vast majority, the indigenous Africans, in their own land.
And the purpose wasn't upliftment.
The primary purpose of any social investment, a very basic school, a rudimentary health clinic, was simply to facilitate exploitation, to produce minimally literate clerks, or to keep the labor force just healthy enough to continue producing the crops or minerals needed for export.
This leads us straight into his analysis of colonial education, which he argues was consciously designed for underdevelopment.
Precisely. The goal of the colonial education system was absolutely not to produce well-rounded, critically thinking individuals capable of leading their own societies. Its purpose was narrowly defined to serve the needs of the European capitalist class
By
providing a small pool of low-level functionaries, clerks, interpreters, messengers, primary school teachers, to reproduce the system. It provided rudimentary literacy and numeracy, but was strategically designed to deny Africans the advanced scientific, technical, and managerial skills needed for industrialization or genuine independent development.
Why deny those skills?
Because if Africans had received the same quality of technical and scientific training as Europeans, they would have eventually been able to process their own raw materials, build their own industries, and compete with the metropole, the very thing colonialism was set up to prevent.
And the content of the education itself was alienating, wasn't it? He gives some almost absurd examples.
Utterly absurd and deeply damaging.
Yeah.
African school children being taught European history, geography, literature, learning about daffodils or snow, things they'd never see, being told in French colonies that the ancient Gauls were their ancestors.
It sounds like psychological warfare.
It effectively was. Rodney cites the poignant reflection of Dr. Koli Busia, a Ghanaian academic and later politician, who realized his colonial education had taught him more and more about Europe and less about my own society.
What was the effect of that?
By relentlessly promoting European culture as superior and African culture as primitive or non-existent, colonial education systematically eroded self-confidence, fostered psychological dependence on the colonizer, and alienated the educated elite from their own people and heritage.
And what about specifically technical or agricultural education? Was that any better?
Generally, no. It was either completely avoided or, when it was offered, it was deliberately inferior, what Rodney calls cut-rate education. Designed to produce slightly more efficient peasants or low-level artisans, perhaps, but certainly not engineers, scientists, or innovative agriculturalists.
Were there any exceptions?
Genuine technical training was provided only in very rare, specific instances where the industrial needs of the colonizer absolutely demanded it. For example, in the highly mechanized mining sector in places like the Congo or northern Rhodesia, companies were forced to provide some minimal, highly controlled technical training to Africans simply to operate the machinery. But this was strictly limited and job-specific, never aimed at fostering broader technological capacity.
So this whole ideological structure, the minimal services, the warped education, led to what Rodney calls political and cultural arrest.
Yes. He quotes the Tunisian writer Albert Memmi, who powerfully described the colonized as being effectively removed from history, made into passive objects rather than active subjects shaping their own destiny, precisely because they lost their sovereign power.
And a key mechanism for this political control was the manipulation of ethnic identity, what he terms institutionalized tribalism.
This is crucial. Colonial powers didn't just rule, they actively reshaped African political landscapes. They often systematically dismantled the larger, developing, super-tribal political structures, the kingdoms and empires that had been consolidating power before their arrival.
And replace them with what?
In their place, they often deliberately elevated and rigidified the concept of the tribe based on kinship or language groups. They codified these divisions, mapped them, sometimes appointed chiefs where none existed, and administered through these often artificially hardened ethnic units.
Why? What was the purpose of emphasizing tribal divisions?
It was a classic divide-and-rule strategy. By fostering distinct, often competing tribal identities and loyalties, the colonial powers made it much harder for Africans to unite on a larger national or even Pan-African basis to challenge colonial rule.
He uses Kenya as an example.
Yes, he points to how Kenya was deliberately partitioned into racial and tribal blocks for administrative and political purposes. The goal was fragmentation, preventing the organic emergence of a unified modern African polity that could challenge European dominance.
And finally, he argues colonialism damaged the very fabric of social solidarity itself.
Yes, by imposing a capitalist logic and promoting a specific kind of individualism.
How did that work?
Colonialism rewarded individual accumulation and achievement, particularly for those who collaborated with the system, the educated clerks, the chiefs who enforced colonial policy, the farmers who grew cash crops for export. This fostered competition and self-interest.
At the expense of?
At the expense of the older, communal principles of shared responsibility, collective well-being, and social solidarity that had been central to many pre-colonial African societies. This focus on individual success might have benefited a very small elite, a comprador class, but Rodney argues it fundamentally contributed to the underdevelopment of African society as a whole, weakening its collective capacity for self-reliant progress.
Okay, so if we pull all these threads together, the economic drain, the social manipulation, the political fragmentation, where does Rodney leave us? What's the ultimate conclusion about colonialism's impact?
Well, his ultimate conclusion is deeply paradoxical, almost dialectical. He argues that the only truly positive development that occurred during the colonial period was, ironically, the one that eventually led to its end.
That's a powerful contradiction. The system designed purely for exploitation unintentionally created the seeds of its own destruction.
Exactly. The very requirements of the colonial system, the need for some infrastructure like ports and railways to get resources out, the need for some minimally educated Africans to run the administration, these inevitably created new social classes whose interests ultimately clashed with the colonial power itself.
Namely,
The African working class, the proletariat, forced together in mines, on plantations, in new urban centers, experiencing exploitation collectively, and also the Western-educated African intelligentsia who used the colonizers' own language and ideas about freedom and self-determination to challenge the hypocrisy and injustice of colonial rule.
so their shared experience of oppression under colonialism forged the basis for the independence struggles.
Precisely. The contradictions inherent in the colonial system itself generated the forces, the organized labor movements, the nationalist parties led by the intelligentsia that eventually fought for and won political independence.
But as we know, the story doesn't just end happily with the raising of new flags. There's a critical postscript to Rodney's work, written by A.M. Babu for later editions, that warns about the post-independence era.
Yes, Babu's contribution is vital. He observes, writing decades after Rodney, that the standard prescriptions for development offered to newly independent African nations, things like increasing exports of raw materials, seeking more foreign aid and investment, had largely failed.
That's how.
They hadn't led to genuine development or closed the gap with the industrialized world. In fact, in many cases, the economic gap was widening, and African nations found themselves trapped in new forms of dependency, often through debt to international institutions like the World Bank and IMF.
And Babu argues the core reason for this failure
Is exactly what Rodney had identified decades earlier. The fundamental problem remained untouched. African production strategies were still dictated, not by internal needs, but by the demands of the world market.
a market founded on colonialism.
A market, as Babu puts it, founded on the hard rock of slavery and colonialism. As long as African economies remained primarily geared towards exporting low-value primary commodities, with prices set externally, and importing expensive manufactured goods, they would remain structurally distorted, lopsided, dependent, and underdeveloped. The political flags had changed, but the fundamental economic structure hadn't.
This leads Babu to advocate for a really radical solution, one that remains politically very controversial today.
Extremely controversial. He calls for, first, a mental decolonization, a complete shift in thinking away from inherited colonial models, and second, a revolutionary path involving a complete break with the exploitative world market system.
A break. And again, reporting this impartially as it's presented in the source analysis, he pointed to certain countries as potential, albeit difficult examples of attempting this break.
Yes, at the time he was writing, Babu cited countries like North Korea and Albania. Now, regardless of their political systems, his specific point, derived from Rodney's logic, was that these nations had consciously opted out of the dominant Western-led global economic system, the World Bank, the IMF framework.
And what was the goal of opting out?
The goal, as Babu saw it, was to implement strict state control over national resources and redirect all those resources toward building an internal material and technological base first, to prioritize production for internal needs, internal consumption, and developing indigenous technology, rather than producing for fluctuating, externally controlled export markets. He saw this kind of radical self-reliance as perhaps the only way to escape the deeply ingrained exploitative structures inherited from colonialism.
So bringing it all together, what does Rodney's powerful, demanding analysis mean for you, the listener, today, especially if you're interested in these questions of global inequality, systems change, decolonial thought?
I think it demands a fundamental reconsideration of what we mean by progress and development globally. Rodney forces us to confront the idea that the process of exploitation doesn't just create poverty and material lack in the exploited regions. It also leads, perhaps more subtly, to an underdeveloped humanity at both ends of the relationship.
Underdeveloped humanity, both at the periphery and at the center.
Yes, both in the exploited nations,
Yeah.
like Africa, but also in the exploiting nations of the center, Europe and North America.
How so in the center?
Well, if we accept Rodney's argument that the material prosperity and technological advancement of the West were built, in significant part, upon centuries of brutal exploitation, systemic violence, and racism,
Then that prosperity is tainted.
it's more than tainted.
Yeah.
It suggests that the development of the center might be, in some crucial human sense, morally and socially underdeveloped itself. A material wealth that perhaps covers over deep inequalities, alienation, and is often defended by immense military power.
And that really is the final provocative thought that Rodney's work leaves us with, isn't it? If the underdevelopment of the wealthy center is just masked by material possessions and weaponry,
Then the struggle for genuine global redevelopment, for transformation, for a more just and humane world isn't just an African problem or a third world problem.
it becomes a shared human project.
Exactly, a shared project for everyone. As Rodney implies, it's undoubtedly a heavy burden, this history, and its ongoing consequences. But, he suggests, confronting it honestly also represents a great possibility. A possibility for a truly global transformation and renewal, one that requires fundamentally changing not just economic systems, but also how we understand ourselves and our connections to each other across the planet.